Hey guys, this is Yoda. This will be my Blood DK rotation guide for War Within Season 1 Mythic Plus. There's another video I made, like kind of a pair with this, that's covering the talents and rotation, or sorry, the talents and stats. This one is going to cover the rotation, so how to play Blood DK rather than how to build it. First, we'll go over offensively, how to maximize your damage. We want to be managing three things here. Number one is the cooldowns. Basically, just send them off cooldown as long as it's not a bad usage. Number two, we want to be juggling some buffs, making sure we're making the most out of those. And number three, we want to not overcap resources and not waste resource generation. Number one is the cooldowns. So the biggest cooldowns are Dancing Rune Weapon. You want to be using this as many times as possible. Whenever you use it, it causes your abilities to basically do extra. Usually it's like triple-ish resource generation and some extra damage. It basically does 2 extra hits, but the extra hits are like 33% as strong. So for example, we're gonna Mirror Rend here. This normally gives you 3 stacks of Mirror Rend if you use it just like vanilla. But then if you Rune Weapon, notice I'm gonna Rune Weapon. This puts me up to 8 because using Rune Weapon gives you stacks. So we're gonna Tombstone back down to 3. And if you Mirror Rend in the Rune Weapon, it gives you 9 stacks up to 12. Also, if you use Blood Plague, it puts 3 Blood Plagues on them. 2 of them are like not as strong. So that's Rune Weapon. You want to use that as many times as possible. Then we have Reaper's Mark, which is new with the Deathbringer tree. It's like the signature ability. So when you use it, it puts a mark on the mob, and it also shoots out a wave of souls, so make sure you're facing them. So you'll see it, I'll use it here. Shoots the wave, it comes back, and then it applies like this mark to them. When this explodes, if it either times out or if it sits 40 stacks, it does some damage, and then it also gives you Exterminate, 2 stacks of Exterminate. When you use that Exterminate, the first one has a chance to give you another Reaper's Mark, and the second one applies Blood Plague. So we're going to slam it here. Boom. Hits everything in front of you. And then one more. We got Reaper's Mark, and it also applied Blood Plague to everything. So that's Reaper's Mark. You want to be using that as many times as possible. There's a caveat here. When you get the Exterminates, you'll notice it doesn't have a duration. And in your Rune Weapon doesn't really like help Exterminate at all. They don't work together. But Rune Weapon works really well together with a lot of your other abilities, such as Blood Plague and Heart Strike. So in your Rune Weapon, generally you want to hold off on spending the Exterminates. Then when the Rune Weapon ends, then you spend the Exterminates. That's just to optimize like your number of enhanced casts in Rune Weapon, and then since the Exterminates don't have a duration. Next we'll go over the Bone Shield spenders. So we have Tombstone and Bone Storm. They both spend 5 Bone Shields. Tombstone gives you a shield, and Bone Storm will generate Bone Shields while also doing some AoE damage and healing you. Bone Shield consumes 5 and it generates 10. So for these, you do want to be using your cooldowns off cooldown, but there's an important caveat for Tombstone and Bone Storm. Since they spend Bone Shields, there's a couple things. Number one, you want to not go too low on Bone Shields. Like if you go to 0, then you're going to like die to melees potentially. And number two, you don't want to go too low because there's a talent called Ossuary. So you want to be staying at relatively high Bone Shield stacks. For Bone Storm, it kind of doesn't matter because it's generating Bone Shields so quickly, so the threshold is at 6 Bone Shields. With Tombstone, it's a little bit different. You want to use it at 8 plus Bone Shields. Also, consuming Bone Shields from Insatiable Blade will reduce the cooldown of your Dancing Rune Weapon. The max cooldown per usage of these is 25 seconds, but there is a compromise because you want to use cooldowns off cooldown, so at 15 seconds left on Dancing Rune Weapon is roughly when you can use these. Like any lower than 15 and you just want to hold it until after Rune Weapon so you get the max cooldown reduction. Higher than 15 generally is considered okay to use. That's like a relatively general rule. If you like need to Rune Weapon immediately, then don't be afraid to just slam it. It's better to like lose some Rune Weapon usage and survive than, the other way. So that's a general rule. The next thing is you've got Abomination Limb, 2-minute cooldown. You want to be using this for damage usually. But there are some situations in Mythic Plus where this is super useful for grouping mobs. Like if the boss spawns some ranged ads that you need to mass group and you don't have it because you sent it for damage, that could be awkward. So generally use it for damage, but sometimes you need to hold it. We also have Soul Reaper. This is single target execute only. If you're fighting one mob and he's 35 or below, use it. Otherwise, don't use it. Pretty simple. We also got Consumption. This is a 30-second cooldown. Hits everything in front of you for some damage. And it makes them take faster damage from your Blood Plague, and it generates 2 runes. So basically some simple rules. Don't use it to overcap runes. Like if you have 5 runes or 6, don't use it. And also, there's a rule where if you have coagulopathy, which is another buff we'll talk about later, you want to use this at 4+ stacks, ideally. If you need to use it for runes, like just slam it beforehand, but for damage, ideally you want to be holding it for 4 stacks of coagulopathy. So that's your cooldowns, offensively. Mostly just use them off cooldown as long as it's not grief. And mainly you need to worry about the bone shield spenders. Make sure you're getting the most cooldown reduction out of them when possible. And also, obviously, make sure you're in D&D when you use them. Generally, you want to be in D&D like the whole time, but just make extra sure you're actually in D&D so that you get the extra effect from Shattering Bone when we consume Bone Shields. So yeah, we'll talk about buffs. So the first one is D&D, which just mentioned. You want to be in D&D as much as possible for Sanguine Ground, 6% more damage, 5% more healing. Unholy Ground, 5% haste. Then Cleaving Strikes, your Hard Strike hits extra stuff. Also, if you read the second part of this is new. Your D&D lasts 4 more seconds when you leave it. That also lasts 4 seconds when it runs out. So if you notice, we've got a 15-second cooldown. It lasts for 10, and then you get 4 extra. So basically, it lasts for 14, and it has a 15-second cooldown. So it's relatively easy to have super high uptime on this. Also, you have a passive called Crimson Scourge, which is whenever you auto-attack something with your Blood Plague, it has a chance to reset. So with resets, it's basically possible to have 100% uptime on D&D, so just make sure you're in it as much as possible. Next, we've got Bone Shields. So we were talking about that earlier with your Dancing Rune Weapon, Bone Storm, Tombstone management. The main thing to keep in mind here is obviously you want to always be above 0 because then you have the armor that you're gaining defensively, but more also important is to stay above 5. Generally the rule is actually above 6 because if you get hit then it consumes 1. So you want to be at 6 or above for Ossuary to make sure this buff is always active. Ideally, to manage Bone Shields, you should not need to use that many vanilla Marrow Rends. Hopefully, it's like either Marrow Rend in Rune Weapon, or Bone Storm, or spending Exterminate. Between those 3, you should be able to maintain relatively high stacks of Bone Shield without having to do vanilla Marrow Rends. If you do end up having to do vanilla Marrow Rends, it can cause you to fall behind on runes, but obviously it's like better to do that than let Bone Shield fall off. Ideally, you're trying to keep up your Bone Shields without vanilla Marrow Rends. If you have to, then you have to. Also, if you have to, then keep in mind you're probably going to be short on runes, so be ready to like hopefully have consumption ready to recover that. You can also consider Death's Caress, since this is more Bone Shields per rune, but this is not technically in the optimized APL, but it's like a if you really need to, you can use it kind of thing. So next we'll talk about another buff, which is Coagulopathy. We mentioned that earlier. That's this talent here. Basically, whenever you Death Strike, it increases the damage of your Blood Plague. It stacks up to 5 times. If it falls off, you need to rebuild it, so it's kind of like a disaster damage-wise, since Blood Plague is a high percentage of your damage. So you notice when I Death Strike, like it's 1 stack, and then Death Strike again, you have 2 stacks, and then, you know, it builds up to 5, and if you ever, like, let this drop off by not Death Striking before the timer runs out, then it goes to 0 and you have to rebuild. So you want to maintain this at 5 stacks as long as possible while you're fighting. Generally, when you're like in a trash pull, you'll need to Death Strike more than that to live. So you shouldn't have to think too much about it. But if the damage intake is kind of low, then just make sure you're Death Striking to keep that buff up. Otherwise, your damage is going to fall off. Another thing we need to juggle, Blood Plague. So that's the last thing. Basically just Blood Plague. Make sure if it's not on the mob, it's on. It's a little high portion of your damage. It's relatively important, so make sure it's on. Also, we didn't mention Ghoul. Raise Dead, just use it off cooldown. It's off global. If you need to get rid of it, then there is a weak aura and a macro I'll post below. You can just push the macro and it'll get rid of it. If you don't have like shattered unit frames, if you use some other unit frames, generally you can also click on a totem here. It's just that my UI doesn't have that, so I need the macro and the weak aura. Thanks to Kyrasis for the weak aura. Next, we'll talk about your resources. So your main 2 resources are Runic Power and Runes. You generate Runic Power by spending runes. Like your Heart Strike gives you 15. If you're in AoE and you Heart Strike more, it gives you more than that. And Marrow Rend gives you 20. Generally, it's 10 RP per rune. But if you Heart Strike, it gives you extra, especially if you're in AoE or if you have Rune Weapon up. So, and also, Death Knight can regenerate 3 runes at once, and it regenerates over 10 seconds. So if you look closely at my runes, you Heart Strike, and then this rune goes on cooldown. And then this one, my UI is weird, so it'll say like this is up in 11 seconds. But basically, it's 10 plus whatever the first one is. So you can regenerate 3 runes at a time. Make sure you have 3 runes on cooldown. And also, generally, you want to be spending runes on Hard Strike, since it generates more runic power. It does more damage per rune than the other stuff. That's generally what you're going to want to be filling your globals with. If you can Hard Strike, or if you already have 3 runes regenerating, then that's when you want to use Blood Boil to reapply Blood Plague, usually. Alright, so that's your resources. We've gone over most of the offensive rotation. Now we'll talk about your defensive abilities. So, we already mentioned Rune Weapon, but Rune Weapon is the one you want to be using as many times as possible. Not only for damage, it also just helps your runic power / rune economy so much, / marrow rend, and it also just duplicates your abilities. It also gives you 35% parry, which we didn't mention before. So you want to be using this as many times as possible, off cooldown basically. Vampiric Blood, it says it has a 1.5 minute cooldown, but realistically with Red Thirst, it's more like between 30 seconds and a minute, like closer to 30 seconds than a minute, really. So you want to be using this as much as possible. Gives you 30% max health, 40% more healing taken. So that's, you know, a pretty good cooldown that you want to be using a lot. When it's down and when it's up, you'll feel like your character, you know, strength. You'll definitely feel a difference in character strength when it's down and up. Generally, you want to be using these, as I said, as many times as possible. If you have to overlap them, that's fine, because if you don't overlap, if you like try really hard to not overlap them, you're going to lose a lot of uses. So generally, it's fine to overlap these. The next cooldown we're going to talk about is Anti-Magic Shell. So this is off global, which is important to keep in mind. Also, it prevents the application of magic debuffs. So like if a debuff is about to be applied to you, you want to pre-AMS it. If you use AMS afterward, then you'll still get the debuff. You'll still get like the shield, but you won't get any of like the preventative effects, so that's kind of important. Use beforehand. Then your other cooldowns are Rune Tap, Lichborn, and Icebound Fortitude. So these are just straight up DRs. Rune Tap is 20% for 4 seconds. It's off global. These are all off global. Rune Tap also eats a rune, so it gives you runic power. You can use that, like let's say you're walking up to this guy, or let's say you've been fighting this guy, he's about to kill you, and you're like, oh no, I only have 33 runic power. What will I do? I can't Death Strike. You can Rune Tap, and then that gives you enough for Death Strike. Bang, Death Strike. That's a cool trick you can do. Lichborn, 1.5 minute cooldown with Deathbringer, gives you 15%. It also randomly makes you immune to some stuff because it makes you undead. Mostly worth noting is that it's the fear that makes you immune to. Icebound is a 2 minute cooldown now. Before it was 3 minutes with a talent that can make it 2, and now it's just always 2. It makes you immune to stuns. It gives you 30% damage reduction, and it can also be used while stunned, so you can break yourself out of stuns too with it. So how are we going to rotate all of these? Generally, as I mentioned, you want to be using your Vamp Blood and Dancing Rune Weapon off cooldown as many times as possible. Then when you don't have these cooldowns up, like, you know, you can use them a lot, but they're not going to have 100% uptime. When they're not up, that's when you want to be filling in with your other cooldowns, such as Lichborn, Rune Tap, and Icebound Fortitude. It's worth noting that Dancing Rune Weapon has a pretty variable cooldown, since if you use Bone Storm and Tombstone, that reduces the cooldown by quite a bit. It's like 50 seconds out of 2 minutes. So if you Rune Weapon and you don't have Bone Storm and Tombstone available for a while, then you should know that, like, oh, I'm gonna have some defensive downtime coming up, so I should be ready to use my other cooldowns. If you're playing Dwarf, you also have Stone Form to rotate in as a cooldown if you need it. You can also AMZ yourself, and you also have Health Pot, which is like, you would use this if you generally, you don't want to just slam Health Pot off cooldown because you can kind of heal yourself normally with Death Strike. You want to use Health Pot if you're gonna die to like the next hit, and you can't like produce a Death Strike before then. There's also this potion you can use in a bind. Frontline Potion is relatively new. If you know you're gonna have bad cooldown downtime and your potion's off cooldown, you can use this. It's actually very, very strong, but it only lasts 15 seconds. Otherwise, you tend to want to just use Tempered Potion for damage. So that's defensive rotation. It's kind of complicated to go over and also kind of variable, so it's not really possible to have a full plan for every pull, mainly because Dancing Rune Weapon's cooldown like changes when Bone Shields gets consumed, and you don't always go into packs with the same cooldown. If you want some examples, I do have VODs posted on the YouTube channel. A lot of them are going to be of Blood DK, so you can see exactly how I played every pack. But those are the general rules. Just make sure you're using these two off cooldown, Dancing Rune Weapon and Vamp Blood, as many times as possible, and you want to fill in with either healer externals or other DRs, basically. So that's defensives. We already covered offensives, so next we'll go over your utility. Death Grip is the main utility that DK has. It's like your signature skill. For Blood, it's on a 15-second cooldown, which is really, really short. It's really useful for 4 main things I found. Number 1 is the basic usage, which is grouping mobs. So let's say you're fighting like these 3 mobs, and there's like this annoying archer over here that's outside the pack. Boom, you can grip them and he's stacked. So that's the first usage. Generally, when mobs are stacked, they're gonna die like way faster because everyone's skills like hit an AoE around them. So yeah, you want to stack them up. Death Grip number 2 is using it as a stop. So let's say this mob is casting some nasty spell. He's about to bolt your ally and you don't have kick up. Boom, you can grip him. They'll stop casting the bolt, and then hopefully that makes time for someone else to kick, or maybe your kick's coming back, or someone else can think of something, blah, blah, blah. So you can use it as a stop. You can also use it as a taunt. If you're having aggro issues, Death Grip counts as a taunt. Whenever you grip something, it'll taunt it. So DK usually has a really easy time with aggro because of that. And also there's a bunch of mobs in Season 1 that fixate your allies. Generally, since you're playing tank, you won't get fixated, but there's like some ads that'll like maybe some spider is chasing your ally down, or some elemental is like chasing them down. It's gonna explode if it hits them. You can help out your DPS by grouping those ads away from them, and then slowing them with chains of ice. That is super useful and makes it way easier for your team to play the game, and they'll love you for it. So that's the fourth use of Death Grip. There are probably some other uses that I didn't think of, but those are the four main uses, at least in Season 1. Then you also have like your stun, asphyxiate. This is super useful if there are mobs that are buffing themselves. Like for instance, some mobs buff themselves and they heal you when they auto attack you, or they're like getting some stacking buffed every time they hit you. You can stun them to, drop stacks or make them not hit you anymore. You also have Blinding Sleet. This is just your generic AoE stop. It hits 90 degrees in front of you. It blinds them for 5 seconds, but you don't really need to worry about that. Usually it just gets broken instantly, and it's just used to stop things from casting most of the time. Chains of Ice, we briefly talked about before. This is a slow. 70% is actually crazy, and you can cast it from range. If you use this effectively, you can use it to kite mobs. And as I said, you can use it to stop fixate mobs from killing your team. So that is super helpful. And we also have AMZ. You can use this as an AoE group cooldown just to help make it easier for a healer. You can use it as a single external, like let's say this guy's about to die to a dot, like an AMZ on his head. And you can also use it for yourself. If your group's not in danger and you're taking a lot of magic damage, you can use it for yourself. Personal utility, we've also got Death's Advance. So passively, you cannot be slowed below 70, which is actually pretty irrelevant. In War Within, there's a bunch of mobs that slow you. You can also use it to prevent knockbacks. So generally when you're tanking something, especially a boss, you want the boss to be staying still as much as possible. So like your group can position well around it. So you can DA to prevent some knocks. One trick that's worth mentioning with grip, so people have seen me do this in the maze in Mists of Eternal Scythe. I assume this is probably going to get fixed at some point, but basically there's this talent called Subduing Grasp. When you pull an enemy, it applies this debuff to them, but if you focus grip, so let's say I set this target dummy to focus, and then I target this mob, and I cast Focus Grip, it's going to put Subduing Grasp on this mob, this PvP training dummy. Target stabs. You can't actually do it on target dummies, but that's how you do it. You focus something that's in range, then you target something that's out of range and cast Focus Grip, and then it'll put the debuff on that. And that mob will like be aggro to you no matter where it is, no matter what walls are in the way. So that's how you pull extra mobs in Mists of Eternal Scythe. So that's your utility, and I believe that is all I wanted to cover for this guide. If I said something really stupid or if I missed something, be sure to contact me or let me know. So that's it. Thanks y'all for watching. Good luck in the War Within, and peace out.